Next on the program is air monitoring at Los Alamos National Lab. We have David Fuehne and
Fuehne.
Fuehne.
Yep.
Fuehne. Thank you. I was getting a lot of, I thought I probably mispronounced. We appreciate you being here, David, and giving us some
Thank you.
knowledgeable update.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you for your opportunity to speak today. We have a couple pages of LANL boilerplate in there that we have to put in everything we send outside, but this is where the fun starts. My name is David Fuehne. I am with the Environmental Compliance Programs Group at LANL, and I am the program leader for it's called the Radionuclide NNMCAb compliance. We'll get into what the acronyms are later. Essentially what I do is I do air monitoring, specifically radioactive air emissions air monitoring from LANL operations. Again, the rad air monitoring program, what we do is we measure airborne emissions of rad material from LANL operations, and we also try to determine what their impact on the public is. We are not directly affiliated with any one program or any one facility at the lab. It gives us a degree of independence, which is nice. We can sort of oversee what's going on at the lab and make our compliance decisions without having anyone pushing down on us, like to make a decision one way or another. We have two focus areas. Number one are the stack emissions or emission sources. Those are the operating facilities at the lab which generate the rad air emissions. The second half of our program are ambient measurements, and those are located out in the public, around the perimeter of the lab, things like that. So we measure both the source of the emissions and what we call the receptor, which is where the emissions are, where the impacts occur. In addition to the air monitoring program, we also partner with the meteorology program at the lab. They are the ones who determine literally which way is the wind blow, things like that, and also the dose assessment program, which helps determine impacts to members of the public from LANL operations. So, again, our goal is to identify and quantify air emissions releases from LANL operations and figure out how, if there are any impacts from these ops. Again, this is a bit duplicative of what I've already said. We measure the sources of emissions. That's our stack monitoring program. We also measure the ambient air concentrations at the receptor locations. What we're specifically looking for are particulate radionuclides like uranium and plutonium, things like that. We also look for tritium in the air, and we have some other things with specialized emissions we'll look at that I'll talk about in a little bit. Also, if any of y'all have any questions, feel free to jump in anytime. I like talking about this stuff. I'll go all day. So just stop me if you have a question. Why we do what we do.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. No.
Has our background in the air quality there moved up?
Actually, what we're seeing now, we'll get into the end, is that we're the lowest air emissions we've ever seen at the lab in the past few years. So it's a good thing. So why we do what we do. First of all, for the federal regulations, the law of the land, that's the Clean Air Act. One obscure part of the Clean Air Act is 40 CFR 6.1 subpart H. That's the radionuclide NNMCAb. It does not. A lot of facilities, even other DOE facilities, have specific permits on a building-by-building basis saying this building can emit this much of rad material, things like that. We do not have that at LANL. We are regulated by the federal DOE, not by the state of New Mexico. Sorry, federal EPA, not DOE, we're federal EPA. So the EPA establishes what I like to call a framework of operations. So they say, if your stack has this much of a potential emission, you monitor it, and here's how you monitor it. But they don't get into specific permits saying building XYZ has this type of monitoring on it. We do that specifically when a new operation starts, but in general, what the Clean Air Act does for us is it says guidance on how to operate and establishes this framework. And again, we report every year to EPA Region 6 in Dallas, as well as headquarters, things like that, talking about what we did in the past year and what our emissions are, things like that. In addition to the Clean Air Act, we have a variety of executive orders that we follow. The biggest one is the DOE Order 458.1 is environmental rad protection. It basically encompasses every aspect of radiological issues when it comes to the public, including air emissions, water emissions, things like that. Plus, how do we transfer property? You may have known LANL is moving property from government control to public control, public access, things like that. So there's a huge program that evaluates what we're handing off is basically is clean, things like that. So we have a big program on that. And also equipment release. If we turn something over from lab operations to the public, how do we clear it and make sure everything is okay? So, other aspects, DOE Order 151.1c, emergency management, that if there's an accident at one of our facilities, we respond to it, and that order talks about how we respond, things like that. And then we report also through 231.1b. You probably have heard of the annual site environmental report, the ACER. That is, the development of that is governed by that DOE order. So.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, we can go back real quick. Do you have examples of property transfer and equipment release?
So one of the property transfers, I know they're working on areas along the front end of TA21. P Mesa, they're working there. Rendia Canyon in Los Alamos has been a part of property transfer. I'm not directly involved with those myself, so I'm not sure what all the status of the various ones are. You guys probably have as good idea as I do on those. But again, it's areas that are no longer needed for LANL operations, LANL support, areas which we feel either have been or can be cleaned up to allow unlimited access on these areas, things like that. So, equipment release. So I know one big area we've been focusing on is metal recycling. We have a lot of shielding, a lot of things, equipment like that, which has either been in rad areas and no longer needed. So what they're doing is evaluating that material, monitoring it, making sure it's clean, and then we will turn, in the metal recycling area, actually recycle that material. And that's actually, it's a program that can pay for itself with the funds you get out of recycling. So things like that. Or generally, anytime you remove a piece of equipment from the lab, if you use it in a lab operation and then you want to use it somewhere else, we have equipment release protocols for those. Okay.
David, I'm just back to that
Sure.
off-site dose limits off-site dose from LANL ops to 10 milligrams. Where are you monitoring that?
So, so that is actually it's a theoretical person. What it is, it's the most impacted person at the lab. Now, the DOE orders, or sorry, the EPA regs do state it has to be a structure. So we're looking at a residence, a house, we're looking at a school, we're looking at a business. We also include churches in that same category. So if there is a structure off-site that is, or even on-site if it's entirely publicly accessible, we look at 24/7 exposure at that location. We assume that you're growing all your food in a garden at that location. You're raising your cow at that location, milking your cow there. So it's a very conservative calculation. We did not want to underestimate anything, so we sort of overestimate a lot of the potential emissions that and potential exposure at that location. So it's yeah. So what that is again, it's an off-site structure that has unlimited public access to it.
Would you be, looking at White Rock?
So we look
possibility?
Yes, we look all around the county. White Rock is every facility will have what we call a facility-specific maximally exposed individual (MEI). So we have our facility MEI. The structures at Area G, you've heard a lot about those. Dome 375, where we have the drums, the RNS drums, that structure has a facility MEI in White Rock. Other ones like the plutonium facility at the lab, PF4, it has its own facility MEI, which is located due north of there, due north of the lab. Our biggest one recently has been the Eastgate area of the lab, mainly due to the accelerator, the Lance Accelerator Facility. I'll talk about those emissions from Lance in a minute. They're different than the rest of the lab. You can't filter them as well. So we end up having higher off-site dose consequence in that facility than the rest of the lab.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. And I'll get my water really quick. Excuse me. So again, this is the acronym time. Radionuclide NNMCAb, that stands for National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants as applied to radioactive material. So there is a NNMCAb for beryllium, there's a NNMCAb for asbestos, all this thing. So the lab, you'll hear us talk about the NNMCAb, and that usually means the radioactive, radionuclide NNMCAb, but it can be, there's other meanings for it. Again, the off-site dose limit is 10 milligram per year from LANL operations. Now, the background in northern New Mexico is 360 to 400 millirem per year just from living up here. That comes from cosmic rays. That comes from terrestrial radiation, uranium in the soil, things like that. So you get about a millirem per day just from living in northern New Mexico. And the lab is allowed to put out up to 10 millirem per year on top of that. So that your background dose will go up if you have any medical exposures, things like that, if you do a lot of airline travel, all that. But in general, again, a millirem a day if you're just living in northern New Mexico. And the lab can emit up to 10 millirem on top of that. We're much, much lower than that. So we report annually in June to the EPA, and that report summarizes everything we do at the lab, our emissions, our doses from each stack, things like that. We also follow due. We order the report, the annual environmental report. That looks at the all pathway dose, not just the air pathway, but any food ingestion, water, if you're drinking water, things like that, direct radiation from storing of rad material above ground, all that stuff that folds into that report. For the most part, the air pathway dominates that dose. It's almost always the same number. If you're looking at the air dose, as when you compare that with the all pathway, they're almost always very similar. And again, that's reported every October in the ACER report. And the ACER for 2015 will be coming out in the next week or so. Yes, sir.
Pardon me, what is the perimeter of your testing?
So right now we look at, we'll show you, I have maps later on, but right now we measure around Los Alamos County, essentially along in Los Alamos, that's along Trinity Drive in Los Alamos, White Rock along State Road 4, and also we measured the back gate of the lab. We also have stations, Santa Fe, Pojoaque, and Espanola we use for background stations, so to look farther reach. Yes, Angelica. So.
Dave, okay, so if background is 360 or 400 per year, and then the offsite dose is 10 millirem, what is a typical reading if background is already that high?
So your background dose, again, that comes from living up here, right? Our last several years, the lab has been less than 1 millirem per year on top of that. So not a great deal.
So like 361 millirem?
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the typical person, again, it depends if you have medical anything. There's a huge variability in that, what type of house you can live in, things like that. So these are all, the 360 is an average for the, and it's usually, for most people, they're actually saying it's upwards of 700 millirem just because of medical and things like that.
So it would be the 360 or 400 plus the 10 would be the...
Yes, so
okay.
LANL, if you go with those numbers up there, you're looking at 4 to 410, that kind of thing. So,
okay, thank you.
Am I cutting in and out? It sounds sort of funny here. So, anything else on this slide? So, okay, so this function, I actually use this sort of as a sales pitch to my management about what we do in the program. So it's a lot of information here. For the stack monitoring side, we have 28 monitor stacks. We consider those to be major sources under EPA parlance. That means we monitor their emissions continuously. We have about 80 non-monitored stacks. These are minor sources. They don't have as much potential emissions. So we do a look back every year to figure out what the emissions were last year. At the LANL facility, that's our particle accelerator. We have real-time measurements, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All the other measurements we do are events. We pull a sample and have it analyzed off-site, so there's a time lag between sampling and data. We then use EPA's plume modeling computer software to determine what the off-site impacts are from these emissions, and we do dose calculations, things like that. On the right-hand side, the ambient air monitoring program, we have 46 stations. Again, most of these are around the LANL perimeter, plus some of those are farther reaching in Espanola and Santa Fe. We do, again, sample collection, and we do air concentration calculations. We also do particulate monitoring. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's basically dust in the air. We see a lot of that in wildfire season in the spring and summer when you can actually see the haze in the air from these kind of things. What I talk about here, the real-time air concentration measurements, are sort of an R&D program we have. That's the environmental continuous air monitors, ECAMs. We actually have those around the TA-54 Dome 375. We have two instruments inside the dome and a few more outside the dome that we can measure in real time what the air concentration looks like in the area. I can call it up on my iPad. I would just, for out of curiosity, I did it before I started talking. You can see a spectrum of what the air concentration looks like inside that dome right now. And so it's something that we can see at the lab and give us, and if it goes above a certain level, it will alarm and call us up and we'll respond accordingly. So stack sampling, again, all significant sources. It includes PF4, TF85, the CMR building, RULAB, the radiochemical F, things like that. We're looking for, again, particulates, vapors, tritium. We do weekly sampling at these facilities so we can really identify if there's a problem, when it happened, and link it back to an operational at the facility. And then we calculate emissions and report them internally to customers throughout the year. And again, at the end of the year, we report these to the EPA. LANS is our accelerator facility. Now, the emissions from this facility are different than all the others. They're radioactive gases, carbon dioxide, things like that. You can't filter these out with a typical high-efficiency particulate air filter, HEPA filter. They just go right through it. It's gas. So these emissions, we control them through other manner. We actually try to delay them. They're very short-lived, like 20-minute half-life. So if you can grab the air and we have a delay system, which is like essentially a mile-long piece of copper tubing. We put the emissions into there, and it spins through this tubing. By the time it comes out the other side, it's pretty much all gone away. So, the plot you see on the screen here is 2005. We had a problem with our emissions control system, and you saw that every day's emissions was a little bit higher than the day before. They did a little fix midway through the year, but things kept going up and up. It turns out our control system had a leak in the inlet valve, so a lot of our rad gases were bypassing this. So this is the last year we had a really a high level of emissions. It was over 6 millirem for that 1 year from LANS. I think our total for the lab was 6.5. So that was a big event for us. Once we fixed that though, now LANS is very, very low. You can see the far right-hand side, you barely even see them on the plot. So our LANS emissions now are less than 1/10 of millirem per year. So it was worrisome while it happened, but it turned out to be a success story because we put a lot of controls in that facility now. Next, we have stack engineering. This is the part of the world where I'll go off the deep end and keep talking forever because I love this stuff. This is how we do the operations of the lab. We do pump maintenance, how we design systems and test them, all that stuff. Essentially, the EPA calls out a lot of things we have to do, and we do them all. So, the minor sources, again, we have about 80 sources that do not meet EPA's criteria for continuous monitoring. We call these minor sources. We do a look backwards. So at the end of 2015, for instance, early this year, we looked back and we interviewed users and scientists and how many samples did they process, things like that. And we calculate what the emissions were or what the emissions could have been. And here we don't take any credit for any HEPA filtration, things like that. So this number always appears kind of high. Again, it's a potential emissions, and we report this every year for our minor sources. So now the other half of the program, in addition to the source, the point sources like an exhaust stack, something like that, we have diffuse sources. These can be cleanup sites, like when they did the TA21 cleanup a few years back. That was a big diffuse source for us. What that means is it's not out of a forced air stack or forced air duct, something like that. Anything that's not a forced air exhaust, we treat as a diffuse source. Our biggest component for this program is the AirNet program. We'll talk in detail about that in a minute. So again, we have a network of stations all around the county and the northern part of the state that looks at concentration measurements. And what we do is, again, we're assuming that the AirNet program, we're using it as compliance for our diffuse sources. Of course, it'll double count anything that comes out of the stacks as well. But it's mainly, the goal of the AirNet is to look at diffuse sources, cleanup sites, evaporating ponds, things like that. And we're looking at particulates and tritium vapor in AirNet. Again, the LANS facility is a weird one. We have diffuse sources there, buildings, things like that, so we have different methods of looking at these radioactive gases. But that's specific to LANS facility. We also have other sites that can come and go year by year, but the biggest program for diffuse emissions is the AirNet program. And so, again, AirNet, we have about 40 stations in continuous operation on the lab. We just updated some of our siting protocol with EPA, where we have put these stations. Because the lab is changing, you know, there's a big development on the east end of town where you come in the Entrada site. We put some more stations out at that end of town because that wasn't very developed when we first put the AirNet program together in the 1990s. We also changed some things because we had some LANL facilities shut down, so we moved some stations to different locations. But again, we have on-site perimeter stations you can see all around the lab here. We also have some up and down the Priory Road. We also have an 8-station network dedicated to Area G. So because that is one giant diffuse source, right? When they're digging holes and burying waste, things like that, we treat that as one large diffuse source. So it has its own network. It's not part of our compliance network, but it's dedicated to tracking anything from Area G. We also have high volume air samplers, which in case there's an emergency or a fire, we can actually start these things up remotely. We can go to our computer at our desk, push a couple buttons, and it'll start air sampling stations all around the lab as well, and that we can use to supplement our existing AirNet program. So AirNet locations, you can see we have regional, we have Santa Fe. This is near the Buckman Crossing down in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe West location. We had one in downtown Santa Fe. Operationally, it was difficult to manage. It was beyond radio range, so it wouldn't, if the pump failed or something, we'd have issues in keeping it running. And also sort of duplicative of the Santa Fe West station, which went in later. So right now we're only operating Santa Fe West for the Santa Fe area. We have a station in El Rancho between the lab and Poake, and we also have a station in Northern New Mexico College in Espanola. So we consider these to be our background stations, and we use those for comparison to what we see around the lab. So the highlight over here, you'll see, we've never seen a LANL impact at our regional stations. Anything outside of Los Alamos County, we've never seen LANL. We've never seen any measurements from LANL operations, basically. So we have seen LANL impacts in the immediate region around the lab, on Diamond Drive, things like that. Never seen anything outside the county. In the past, we've had, yes, sir. So.
Do you do anything west? I mean, you know, like Cuba?
So not part of our network here. Jemez Pueblo does have a station that's farther west. Again, with all the pueblos, San Ildefonso has stations, Santa Clara has stations, Jemez has stations. For some of those, we'll actually have them analyzed, but we do not treat them as part of our network. We do not release their data publicly. I think after a certain amount of time, it goes to the Intellis system, but it's not. But yeah, that's our western station.
Okay.
We have stations on the west gate over here. We have one at the west gate of the lab that's basically essentially a background station because the prevailing winds are south to north or southwest to northeast. So that's that one and the one on Pyrito Acres both serve as upwind stations for us. Okay. Special response, again, this is our high volume samplers. They operate at about 10 times our normal AirNet flow rate, and they can get a very statistically significant sample very quickly. It can duplicate a 2-week sample within about a days of operation. And so these are the ones we can, if there's a fire, if there's something like that, we can either remote start existing stations or deploy new ones. We've done this whenever there's had fires at the lab, Ancho Canyon back in 2007, I think we had an issue. We put a couple stations out, things like that.
Mr. Chair, David, during those wildfires, the past 18 years, we've had 2 major wildfires. Was there any increase of either high levels of radioactive waste or constituents, materials beyond the ambient or the background?
Everything we saw was consistent with what you'll see at any wildfire anywhere. So during the Cerro Grande fire, there was actually another fire in southern New Mexico at the same time. One of our folks actually deployed an air monitoring station at the southern New Mexico fire location for comparison, and it turned out to be essentially identical. So you'll have a lot of naturally occurring rad material, which will settle on the ground, and the fire and flames and heat will resuspend that. So we will see elevated levels of elevated rad air concentration levels during a wildfire, but it's entirely driven by naturally occurring rad material, not LANL operations. So,
thank you.
Yeah. So, anyone else?
how
So-
low a dosage or concentration
So
could it detect?
the Clean Air Act specifies we have to be able to measure down to about 1 millirem per year. We actually can measure about 100 times better than that, so much less than 0.1 millirem per year on our AirNet stations. We typically report doses from AirNet in the 0.04, 0.05 range. That's our typical average, what we see for AirNet. So it's well below EPA requirements and well below.
Another question, how do our measurements compare to the other DOE sites, the other 7 sites?
They're, for the most part, everything we're seeing is driven by, even though we do a background correction for the soil and things like that, we still have slightly higher levels than of uranium here than they do like at Pacific Northwest and Washington State, things like that. So we have slightly higher, but still very low. You know, like the Nevada test site, the National Nuclear Science Center, or whatever they call themselves, NNSS right now. They actually do not background correct their data. So they actually, last year, all of the people who do what I do, we get together every year and talk about what we measure. They had the highest reported measurements in the DOE complex, about 1 millirem per year or so. But it was probably all background radiation because they don't take any credit, or they're not looking at what do they contribute to that dose. They're just looking at what do you measure, and that's what we so. What we report to EPA is what's the layer that LANL puts on top of what we normally see, right? So we're looking at background corrected data, whereas in the ACER report that's going to come out next week, we look at what you see when we turn our samplers on. So we don't background correct that. So it's different drivers, different goals, that kind of thing. But again, it's all pretty similar if you have the similar soil types, elevation, things like that. So, yeah. Anyone else? So our meteorology program, again, this gets into how we do plume analysis. We have 5 meteorology towers located, 4 on the mesa tops, 1 in the canyon. We look at, and you can actually see this on the web. A lot of people look at our Met site during ski season to find out if it's snowing on the ski hill, things like that. So there's not just LANL usage for this. It's required by executive order to have this. Basically, if you have a nuclear facility like our wet tritium facility or our plutonium facility, you have to be able to predict meteorology trends. So in case there's an accident, where do you evacuate people, things like that. So our program is built to meet that reg. But it also serves our purpose for modeling plume emissions. So this is one thing we talked earlier, the dose assessment program. If we're looking at our max exposed individual person standing right here, right? So it has to be a person, it has to be a structure, so like a house, and then you're assuming that you get all your drinking water at that location and you're breathing your air there, 24/7, 365, the whole time there, and your garden's there, all your food comes from there, things like that. So these are all the pathways we evaluate and when we do our dose calculations. Surface water, groundwater, soil, things like that, fish in the water, all that stuff. So we evaluate all these various pathways and look at the LANL impacts from those pathways. And again, all that gets reported in our site environmental report. So again, various limits. We talked some about this already. 10 millirem per year is the EPA limit for air. Everything else is a DOE limit, 100 millirem per year. So that's what we're allowed under the DOE to put out on top of your background air emission, the background radiation we get, which is about 400 millirem a year. Typically, our all pathway contribution is 3 millirem or less. This is a bit of an old slide. Our all pathway contribution for the past several years has been much less than 1 millirem. So, and we use that number for other DOE Order 458 as well. Again, calculations, the EPA provides us a code. It's actually CAP 88. It's called version 4 now. What that does is it turns a stack emission into an off-site dose. You put in things like how tall is your stack, how fast the wind blows, things like that. So we also have a variety of databases. Basically what I'm showing, again, this might be a sales pitch from my boss more than you guys. We do a lot of work. We do have a lot of things we do for EPA methods. Supporting operations in our program, we have a new project review program that anytime Joe scientist at the lab wants to do a new experiment, they fill out what's called a PRID. It's Permitting Requirements Identification. That gets sent to us. We evaluate it for, are there permits we need? Are there new monitoring we have to do? Things like that. We also have people, our organization, working in all these LANL facilities, so they identify new activities and call back to us if they need help doing with monitoring or whatnot. We have a very thorough quality assurance program, procedures, test methods, things like that, which dictates how we do our operations. Again, we have our particulate matter, general smoke during wildfires. We have it's a regulatory driver for it, but it does come in handy during wildfire season to be able to measure what the air concentrations are, especially for sensitive employees, people who may have allergies, things like that. It's a good program for that. And we participate in DOE complex-wide initiatives, all that stuff. Some upcoming events we have. We just put out our 2015 EPA report in June. Again, our off-site dose from 2015 was 0.13 millirem, so it's less than our 10 millirem limit and lowest in LANL history, which is a good thing. So we also have our ACER report coming out in the next week or so, or maybe Friday. So that looks at not just the air pathway, but everything LANL does in the environmental perspective, and it's available, I think, is the best way to get it. We don't do much hard copy distribution anymore. So, some new facilities starting operations. What happens is the DOE changed their technical standard for how much rad material you have in a building. So a lot of facilities, they want to get operations out of the big nuclear facilities into smaller facilities. So as a result, we have more work going on in smaller facilities. And from EPA perspective, that means we have to monitor these sources now. So we're going in and doing testing for stacks and things like that to make sure we're still under, we can still monitor our emissions, all that. So from the AirNet program, again, like I said, in 2015, we reevaluated our siting criteria, and we got reaffirmed EPA approval for our program. One big one that might be of interest is the AirNet calculations all moved to the Intellis system, intellisnm.com. So now that system runs our sample planning, sample collection, and the data analysis and reporting of our concentrations, things like that. It's all publicly available right now. And that started, we moved a lot of historical data over there, but starting in 2015, everything was done through Intellis. So, results in perspective, 0.13 millirem was our dose last year, very, very low. It's hard to separate that from the noise when you're doing measurements. I think 2011 was when they did the MDAB cleanup. That year we were 3.5 millirem, mainly due to all the activity they had at cleaning up disposal area B, which was right on DP Road, very close to the public. Before that, we had the Lance, I talked about the event in 2005. Beyond that, our emissions have all been below 1 milligram per year, so less than 10% of our annual limit. Just to reiterate, our AirNet programs shows no impact at regional stations. We can see things in Los Alamos County, but there's nothing but background levels outside the county. We used to have stations at Taos area. We had stations at Picaris, Pueblo. We've had stations all over the place. We've never measured anything. So we sort of brought our regional network down to the three critical population centers closest to Los Alamos, Espanola, Pojoaque, Santa Fe. And in the summary, we have a comprehensive program to evaluate new operations, measure emissions from major and minor sources, measure ambient air look measurements or meet air concentrations, and adapt to all changes. So that's the whole presentation right there. Any questions?
Thank you, David. Any questions?